familiar to you. Denmark. Oh, I'm so sorry you weren't on the list. Welcome, Denmark. Anyway, our next speaker is very familiar to you. He's the co-MC of the Glastonbury Symposium. Well known throughout the crop circle world, wrote the fantastic Vital Signs book, and also does a lot on conspiracies, which he wrote the Truth Agenda and a book called Conspiracies. So I think I better just get off and let him get on, because he will want his full 60 minutes. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andy Thomas.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you. Well, good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to give you a presentation today called Making the Leap. But before I do this, I need to demonstrate a new, fantastic piece of technology to you. So let me introduce you to the SimpNav. Now, I don't know about you, but I find it often difficult to find my way to the stage here. No, really. No, really. Because, we live in a world where it's very hard to know how to get from A to B, but we've invented these fantastic devices on our phones and in our cars, and these wonderful things that can help you find where you need to go. So we've got the SimpNav now, so I can never again get confused on my way up to the stage. So I'm going to test it. Okay, so we're just going to have a little test of this device here. So here we go. Let's see if I come down to about here. And right, okay, let's switch it on. Okay, let's see how it works.
Walk 10 paces forward, keeping to the center.
Yep.
Turn around. Turn around again. Walk several further paces forward,
Yes.
keeping to the right lane.
Yes.
At the next aisle, turn right.
Are you sure?
I said,
Excuse me, I'm so
turn
sorry.
right.
Right, so,
You're causing a disturbance.
right, okay. Right. Are you sure about this?
Where are the stewards?
Turn around when possible.
Yeah, oh, you're all right. Yes, I'm so sorry, madam. I'm so
Turn
sorry.
around when possible.
We'll give you your money back soon. It's not worth anything anyways,
Now
we found out
turn
yesterday.
Right, stand on the spot and pirouette while whistling Colonel Bogey.
No.
Jump 3 places in the air and hover, simmering gently.
Right, enough. Right, enough.
You have reached your destination.
I think that proves the point, doesn't it? Okay, this is tomfoolery, but it does make a very serious point. Because we live in a world today where we sort of expect now to be told where to go, especially, in the realm of driving. So, they're wonderful things. If you're in a city especially, knowing where you're going and not having to look at a map is safer, I will concede. But increasingly, and studies have shown this, not just me saying this, people are getting in their cars, and especially when there's a sat-nav that just instantly comes on, it tells them where to go, and people leave it on. And so now, even when they're going to the shops around the corner, they're still doing everything the sat-nav tells them to do. And increasingly, and I'm not being funny here, studies are showing our brains are changing as a result. And our sort of retention of memory, our ability to navigate our way around the world is being lost. The studies are showing our brains are actually changing because we're losing the power to actually sort of find our own way around the world. Because we don't need to remember it because we're being told continually. And therefore, that's all well and good all the time you're being told what to do. But what happens if it stops? You're going to lose the ability to actually make decisions for yourself. And this is really serious. So the brain itself, they think, may begin to actually change. Who knows? The ultimate form could be something like this. But I mean, it is true, isn't it? It is true. And we're now increasingly used to the notion of being told what to do. This is very worrying. I mean, the kind of people that come to a marvelous place like this, you're probably of a certain mind that you don't like being told what to believe. But if that's the case, then don't be too quick to allow yourself to be told where to go and what to do all the time, because we're getting into a habit of that that's going to make it very, very difficult to break out of it. And it's going to make it incredibly difficult, therefore, sooner or later, for later generations to actually think for themselves. This is a really serious business, and we need to sort of like check it now while we're at the cusp, because we're living in a world at the moment, we've still got people. We can remember the rag and bone man and horse and carts going through the street. But we can also see the future where everything is going to change. What it is to be human is about to change. And in fact, we've taken an interesting step towards that recently with the advent of Google Glass. Now, if you haven't heard about this, these are glasses you can wear, and this is only the beginning. They're quite crude as technology goes, but it's the beginning of having continual access to the internet. So you won't just be wandering around looking at your phone. You won't need to, because when you've got these glasses on, you'll be seeing the internet at all times. This is what you'll see. You'll look at somebody, and first of all, information will come up about that person sooner or later, because, you know, we already love to put all our data onto Facebook and what we've had for dinner and all of this. So that will be in the universal sort of knowledge bank. And so you look at someone and you know who they are. You get a scroll telling you all about them. Nice. And more to the point, you'll be told things of interest. So if you see the demonstrations of this, people are walking along the street and little signs appear saying, you know, nice restaurant here or public toilets here. But after a while, also, the sat-nav, yes, turn right, turn left, go here. And so we're on the fantastic road to becoming robots, basically, where we'll never think, we'll never need to have a map or think about the geography of where we're going, because we'll just be continually told it. Now, never mind the big risk of what happens if one day all the satellites go off, which is a serious risk, and we've talked about that here before. But, you know, nonetheless, you know, the fact is, if you don't know where you're going and you're just relying on where to be told where to go, right, the fact is you're losing something precious. So personally, yeah, if I'm in a city, I might use a sat-nav, but I increasingly try to read a map before I'm going somewhere and get a sense of the shape of where I'm going. And then you're not on your own if it does suddenly go down. But there's a wider principle here. So beware, because it is, of course, a fantastic tool of control. So, you know, I'm very fond of quoting Orwell, but let's quote Orwell again. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Because it's not just that we're going into a world where our movements, our actions are being controlled. Our very knowledge of what we are as a species, the knowledge of our history, and the knowledge of the present is absolutely being manipulated before our eyes. Now, many of you know this already. That's why you've come to a place like this, to hear people put the other side, to lift the lid and see a little bit more about what's going on. But let me give you a very good example of mass manipulation. So Russell Brand, let's talk about Russell Brand for a minute, and I'll say a little bit more about him later on. Russell Brand's a mercurial figure. I think a very important character in popular culture at the moment. And that's not to say at all that I agree with everything he thinks, but he's one of those dangerous characters. When he's on television, you like it, because you know he'll very quickly point out the hypocrisy of what's going on. And if you see him in interviews, he is devastating in just revealing the paucity of the journalistic mind. He's fantastic. He reminds me a bit of, Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols, or John Lydon, as he's really known. He used to have that too before he became a pantomime dame, He had that too. He had that sort of way of making you feel, whoa, someone's got right to the truth here. So he's increasingly becoming involved with things like trying to raise awareness of big issues in society. And some of you may have heard this, but maybe not, will know that just a few weeks ago there was a huge anti-austerity rally in London. Now, we keep reading the papers, don't we? And they tell us that the economy is great. Britain's starting to do well now. The trouble is that's not yet filtering down to the everyday people. That might be true in the city of London, but that's not the same as it helping all of the likes of us. But get this. It is estimated, around 50,000 people on the streets of London. 50,000, that's an awful lot of people. I mean, in history books, you read about the Chartists in the 1800s, and they might have had 50,000 people there. This was of historical note. How much coverage did this receive on the news? Not a single major TV network even reported it. They didn't even acknowledge that it had occurred. Isn't that scary? It scares me. There were a few websites that reported it, but not many. It was as if they just wanted to pretend it wasn't going on. This is a huge manipulation. This is absolutely controlling knowledge of what's going on, even on your own doorstep. And yet, the same week, the BBC, that couldn't find a single sort of line space for this, managed to make one of its key headlines, even on Radio 4, the fact that Danger Mouse is coming back. I bet you many of you here don't even know what Danger Mouse is. But if you're watching kids' TV in the 1980s, well, you would do. So the BBC makes a big deal. I mean, it's a headline. I'm not being funny. It was one of the 4 headlines. This was the week that ISIS was taking over Iraq. But they still found room for this. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that there are certain things clearly we're being distracted to look towards, harmless nonsense, and other things that they absolutely don't want us to hear. And it really shows you actually how afraid of people like Russell Brand the mainstream media now is, because they don't want to report what he's saying. And you would have thought he would have been quite a good person to say, even just to make fun of, but no, they can't risk it. Just in case he does this thing where he speaks the truth, and then you broadcast the truth, and they don't want any more of that. And bear in mind, the good old BBC, this is the same week, they managed to run a story about the workers' rights lady, Erin Brockovich, who's on some new campaign in America. Do they show a photo of Erin Brockovich? No, they show a photo of Julia Roberts playing Erin Brockovich. So again, they could have shown a photograph of somebody real, but they go for the fictional version. Funny, isn't it? It's a little thing, but it's very, very telling. And I think we really need to look very carefully at where our consciousness has been directed. Now, I'm going to risk annoying a few people here, but I'm going to say this anyway. I think the coverage of World War I is over the top. And listen. Bless, literally, everybody that fought in it. Anybody that knows me knows I 100% honor the fallen, the war dead. I really do. But there comes a point where there's overkill. The coverage of World War I is going to go on for the next 5 years, the 100th anniversary, on the BBC especially. And already, it's day after day, there's another program. You get little news bulletins on Radio 4 as if it were 100 years ago. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, I kind of knew about World War I. Why do I need this brought into my life now? And if it's not World War I, it'll be a massive coverage of World War II. Again, yes, let's honor them. But then it starts to go over the top, and it's Dunkirk, and it's the anniversary of this, and it's that. And it worries me, because what all of this is doing is seeding a war mentality and an acceptance of war as a necessary evil. And after a while, it begins to feel like manipulation. And I'm feeling manipulated now whenever they push this on me. And I really think there's something to this, because look around you and you put the news on, as we will see in a second, war is all around us. But we don't generally like it as a public. Let's go back a year or so, when you may recall the Western leaders were talking about going in and bombing Syria. Now, the Syrian situation is very complex and no easy answers, okay? But just going in and indiscriminately bombing, supporting this rebel faction or that rebel faction, plainly wasn't going to work. And for once, the government in this country and ultimately in America realized it wasn't going to work. you could feel there was a build-up. Here we go, it's the weapons of mass destruction thing all over again. We could feel ourselves being pushed into it. I think the powers that be honestly believed that we'd forgotten about the weapons of mass destruction thing. I really do. I think in their arrogance, they thought they won't mind about that anymore. But we didn't. And in fact, so many people said, no, we are not behind you on this, that in the end, they decided not to act. Or at least not obviously, not publicly, because there's a lot of other stuff going on. But this was a major moment. It was a moment where you realize actually what the collective thinks does matter. It does have an effect, because they need our consent. That's why they had to manufacture the whole weapons of mass destruction thing with Iraq. They need enough people to be on their side, if only because they're worried about not getting the vote at the next general election. Even if it's for a silly reason, it matters. And therefore, note that, because when you protest and when you sort of get up and you say your bit, somewhere down the line, though the BBC may not report it, it counts. And that was a good example of that. So we didn't go bombing into Syria, but in a way we didn't need to, because they're bombing each other to bits anyway. Sadly, and we talked about this last year, and I'm not going to go through it again today, there is a lot of evidence of Western manipulation of what's going on in Syria. What's happening over there is not separate to the decisions that our governments are making. A lot of evidence of agent provocateurs. When you look at what's going on in Iraq now, the notion, and Jason picked up on this yesterday, the notion that ISIS, this sort of strange jihadist group that nobody had ever heard of in the mainstream until 1 week, could take over an entire country near enough, and everyone say, oh, we didn't know that was going to happen, is just ridiculous. Particularly in Iraq, where there must be so much intelligence floating around. You think the Western powers didn't know that was going to happen? Of course they did. And therefore, you have to say the fact that they allowed it to get so far advanced that ISIS were able to do what that they did tells you immediately that it suits somebody in the West that this has happened. Now, some people always say, oh, well, it doesn't make sense. It's all chaos. Why would anybody want that? Well, if destabilization is your mandate, if that is your desire, because actually it makes the Middle East more malleable, fantastic. The more destabilized, the better. You've got to think more like a conspiracy theorist, They're not always right, and I am one. And listen, Gaza, what a sad, unending story. And just to say this, yes, it appears to be someone else's problem, but no, it isn't. The whole way that the whole thing with Palestine and Israel got set up, I'm afraid the West was largely responsible for not really thinking it through. And there's so much more that we could do, but we don't, for all known historical reasons. So what's going on there now? Again, it's not separate from us. We, unfortunately, have a long history with it, and it's a sad tale that's going to go on and on until somebody finally says, all right, let's all, on a very international basis, really focus on the issues here. But where I want to go for a minute is Ukraine, for fairly obvious reasons, and yet some people haven't quite twigged what the bigger issue is here, it seems to me. So, okay, Ukraine suddenly has a revolution. Not the first time that's happened in Ukraine, as we know. Russia has been very vocal in saying the West played a big role in kicking off this revolution. And actually, if you look at the evidence, we did. It's almost overwhelming that we made damn sure that that place got destabilized as well. And we haven't got the time to go into the detail today. Again, I'm afraid we have many more fingers in pies in Ukraine than it may appear. And, of course, one of the key moments was when people started to get shot in the fighting. Now, even Channel 4 News, on one occasion, managed to report that the shooting, which, of course, the news had initially said was all coming, from what is now the old faction that ran Ukraine, even Channel 4 News said, in fact, it looks like the shooting might have started from the rebels. And there was a leaked email that Channel 4 News even reported saying it more or less proved, in fact, it was the rebels who had started shooting. And I said to Helen, I bet you'd never hear that story on the news again. And sure enough, that was the end of it. It was never mentioned on mainstream news ever again. But if you look at the evidence, it's very clear. There were agent provocateurs there. The West definitely helped to stir it up. Now, maybe it hasn't worked quite as they thought, because, of course, events have taken on a rather dark pattern of their own since. So, first of all, of course, the Crimea is effectively annexed. Now, was that part of the plan? Maybe not. I mean, the good news about New World Order plans and ruling elites is they don't always go right. Don't think they've got it all so sewn up that everything works. And I get a hunch that maybe this wasn't part of the plan. And yet Crimea, historically, has always been the scene of big shifts in human social history. I mean, you got, the Crimean War of the Victorian days, of course. But, if you go back to the end of the Second World War, you have this marvelous moment in Yalta in Crimea where what you see is effectively the future of the New World Order. So here's Churchill. Suddenly, Britain had really lost a lot of its power in the world. Economically, we were wrecked, even though officially we were victorious in the war. Roosevelt in the middle there, he's looking fairly chipper because America came out of it very well. They were very strong. If you look back at the history of the New World Order project, it is real, by the way. It's not just a conspiracy theorist fantasy. People like Terry Boardman have told you the story from this very stage. Or read my book, Conspiracies, to read the actual history of it. It's a real, verifiable project. But the torch originally was Britain and America. But the torch really passed essentially to America at this point. And then sitting over there on the right is Stalin, of course, who'd been an ally up to this point, but wasn't for very long. Because Russia really at this point was set up as the new big enemy. And it was a role they were more than happy to play. Stalin, let's not make any excuses for him, was a nasty piece of work. So he thought, yeah, fine, I'll play that role. If you read your Orwell, you'll know you always need a big enemy. A state needs an enemy to kick against. And this was the fantastic moment of that. And so we had the beginning of the Cold War and the rise of the Soviet Empire. And then when that started to crumble, Al-Qaeda was brought in to replace it for a while. But that's now getting sort of a bit loose. That's not clear where it stands. So what we've got today, in a strange echo of all that, in Crimea being the place where a lot of it kicked off, is the new Cold War. Make no mistake, this is a new Cold War. And it's probably been long in the planning, where once again, we've set up this time Putin as the new big enemy, and once again, he's more than happy to play it. So I'm not making any excuses for Putin or what Russia are doing, but there's more to the story than meets the eye. And the propaganda we are being fed at the moment absolutely is Russia as the big bad enemy again. And that's going to crank up and up because we need an enemy and they're happy to play the role. They want to look strong on the world stage. And yet there are weird mind games going on. So you've got that aspect occurring, but note this. Having a new big enemy that you can't respect, that's no good. If they're just buffoons, figures of fun, that's no good. You're not going to be scared of them. You've got to build them up. Now, look at how Putin gets represented in the mainstream media over here. They have a little fun with him, but he's kind of shown a weird respect. And, we all chuckle at it, but the man of action photographs that they keep coming out of Putin, on safari, we love it. And secretly we go, okay, he's some guy to be reckoned with. He straps his shirt off and he gets the gun and he does all these amazing gung-ho things. So we're sort of secretly set up for a little bit of admiration of Putin. Note, however, on the other side of it, how Obama, and we know ultimately they're all puppets, but putting that aside for the moment, note how Obama is personified. They're digging out these terrible old pictures of him with a fag in her mouth, and up the top, I don't know if you can see there, but he had a fly landed on his face in the middle of a speech. And these are the images that go around, and he's seen as weak. He's been set up as a bit of a weak leader. And I don't know if any of you have seen this, the latest one to kind of denigrate Obama is the fact maybe Michelle Obama is a man. Have you heard this one? Joan Rivers said this, been publicly on TV the other week. She's a transsexual, and therefore that means Obama's gay. There's a lot of homophobia going on here. There's racism going on here as well. I mean, it's funny, but it's not funny at the same time, okay? Look it up for yourselves. I'm not going into the ins and outs of this. There's lots of websites now that will purport to tell you that Michelle Obama is a man. Make up your own mind. I mean, does it really matter? They're all puppets anyway. However, it's being used to denigrate the Obama administration, all right? And so there are strange mind games going on. We are being manipulated to think in certain ways. And Russia, we need to take them seriously. And of course, in the last week or two, it's all taken on an even nastier and more shadowy bent. So, the downing of an aeroplane is very serious anywhere. When it happens in a place like Ukraine, it's big, big stuff. The conspiracy theories are numerous. I mean, the big popular one at the moment is that the plane that came down in Ukraine, in fact, was the original missing Malaysian aircraft that was shot down over Ukraine to make it look like they'd shot down an airliner full of passengers. Well, although there's a neat symmetry to that idea, it really doesn't make any sense. Because then you've got to say, well, how did they fake all the bodies? Are all the relatives actors? Some websites will tell you they are, but there comes a point where you go, come on, that's an awful lot of people not blowing the whistle, It doesn't add up. So let's assume a real jetliner was shot down. Who shot it down? We don't know. I do think it is highly possible a third party did it. I really don't think that is so beyond the realms of possibility. When you look back at history and you see how often history has been manipulated by third parties, deliberately trying to accelerate the conflict. And if that was the case, bear this in mind. Okay, it all seems very terrible that there's this potential sort of conflict and a new Cold War. But remember that war is business. War is money, money, money. We love it, say some people. Bring it on. Because war keeps the economy going. The war economy appears to sort of not always be in the public mind, but here's the thing. If we didn't sell arms to all these companies, or rather all these countries around the world, our economy would collapse tomorrow. This is something we've touched on before. Sadly, the Western way of living is supported by funding misery in other countries. That is a fact. And note the people who are very keen for action around the world, like people like Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who seems to be very avuncular and sort of very jolly, yo-ho-ho, but he's always saying, we must act. We need to show Putin we're strong, and we need to go here, and we need to go there, and we should send the troops into Syria, or whatever it is. Look at the companies he's working for. He's one of the biggest arms-dealing politicians in the country, okay? And he makes massive money from going to war. So, of course, he wants war. So be very, very careful when we see people like him appearing to just say, well, yes, I'm just here because we need to protect Western interests. Yeah, and also he needs to make his bank account a bit bigger. Talking of banks, of course, well, we all know, and, people like Bradley Manning and that have tried to show the way the world really is. And Edward Snowden, too. Now there are conspiracy theories around the two of them, too. But I think they have clearly shown to us the way the industrial military complex works. And banks are basically calling the shots. And it's not quite as straightforward as the standard conspiracy view of banking. Yeah, there is an absolute truth to the way they are personified on one level. But at the end of the day, if you've got the money, you can pull the strings. And if you can pull the strings, of course, you can therefore pretty much control anything you want. The people up in the tops of the glass towers know very well no government is going to touch them. Have as many credit crunchers as you want. No one's going to go near them because they are effectively untouchable. Because the governments don't want to annoy them because they know that they're not really the ones in control. The City of London is a completely separate entity from the rest of the country. Even politically it is. It's got its own mayor. A bit like the Federal Reserve in America, which is an utterly illegal organization that we all just think is the Bank of America. But it isn't. It's just a private company in essence. And what's happened in recent times is the divide between the haves and the have-nots, which has always been present, particularly in Britain and its class system, is bigger than it's ever been. So they might tell you the economy is getting better, but yeah, for who? because it's not trickling down to some of the people at the bottom. And the people at the bottom, very cleverly, have been blamed as the ones responsible for all our financial woes. Have you noticed this? It's the single mothers, it's the benefits claimants, it's the poor. They brought us down. And you look at the figures and that's just a joke. No, it's the people in the glass towers that brought us down, but they don't have to carry the rap. So our attention's been very cleverly focused on the ones at the bottom so that we don't hold to account truly the ones at the top. And we all just carry on now as if everything's fine. And they'll always say, oh, well, we need these bonuses. We need these levels of money to keep the economy going that serves everyone. And it doesn't, it serves them. It doesn't serve us. And, if you want evidence of that, no more evidence will you find in gas prices. Well, they tell us again, they need to be this high. Or we'd be making a loss if they weren't this high, and so on. And yet we have people dying. Here today, in Britain, in the winter, people are dying because they dare not put their gas on. What a pathetic way to live. This is not right, and we should never have stood for it. Why aren't there people on the streets about this? Well, the reason is that we are told constantly, oh, well, it has to be like this, and there are solutions. We have solutions in the pipeline, literally. And then people like William Hague, who's retiring soon, thank God, only to be replaced by yet another puppet, but then he gives you the truth if you're listening carefully. So all the Russia stuff blows up, all the Crimea stuff, the Ukraine stuff blows up, and you get the classic line that comes out of his mouth, which is, this shows why we must become more energy self-sufficient. Bing! And the light bulb goes off, and you think, that probably means fracking. Later on, Simon Welsh is going to be here this afternoon. Do not miss him. He's going to give you a very personal voyage, his journey of how he became a leading anti-fracking campaigner. So I'm going to skim very quickly over this. Watch Simon's presentation later on. Fracking is potentially one of the worst things ever to hit the British Isles, and it's barely begun. Because if you look around you at what's going on around the rest of the world, no matter how many times our government says it's safe and it doesn't do any harm, I'm afraid that is not borne out by the actual evidence, not the evidence that the pro-fracking companies give you, the actual evidence. And the actual evidence is that it is polluting the water. It is leaving very dangerous chemicals in the water that sooner or later will rise up through the water table. When they say, oh, it's fine because we're drilling under the water table, yeah, what, you think that's always going to stay down there? Yeah, it's never going to bubble up through some capillary action? Of course it will. Methane is being released. The amount of water, the billions of gallons of water they need to frack is, particularly in southern England, going to take away water that is not that abundant in some years as it is. None of this is being talked about. The government is selling us fracking. It's marvelous. It will solve all our energy needs. And we won't need to worry about people like Russia. And they're giving money to councils. They're bribing councils. And they're putting out the propaganda over and over. It's all fine. What they don't show you, and Simon will say more about this later on, is what fracking actually does to the landscape when you take it to the nth degree. Now, I doubt they'll go this far in southern England, but they could. This is, I think, Philadelphia. There are many places around the world you look. You can't just have one fracking rig. You then need another to connect to, and then you need another. And before you know it, bye-bye countryside. We're very contained, we're very compressed here in Britain. We can't actually take this level that some big countries can. And if nothing else, imagine the traffic. The lorries are going to be on your local roads, right? You may moan about the lorries now. You wait till you see what's coming when these need constant supplying. I like to hope that when people begin to see the damage that fracking is going to do, and I'm afraid I think there will be sacrifices, when it actually clicks, especially with Tory voters, oh, it's this? You didn't tell me it was going to be like this. Maybe there'll be a reversal. But I'm afraid in the interim, we're going to lose something. Some people think there's a wider agenda to this, literally an agenda. Some of you may have heard of Agenda 21. Now, we ought to get a speaker in to cover this at some point. Cutting a very long story short, Agenda 21 was supposedly a document produced after the Rio conference, and it was looking at sustainable ways of living in the future. And it basically proposed ways we could save the earth. But actually, how it's seen, certainly in the truth-seeking world, it is a very dark agenda that what it's about is more control. Because ultimately, it gives the governments of the world the right to throw you off their land. We've now discovered with the new fracking laws, you can't stop them drilling under your land, for instance. So in fact, we don't own anything. You might think you do, but you don't. And Agenda 21 seems to have an agenda of pushing people into large conurbations, taking them out of the countryside, making them more controllable, making them more containable. Now, why would they want that? Is it because if we're not out in the countryside, we can't see what they're doing? I mean, look at what's going on in Antarctica today and the Arctic as well. These supposed icy paradises we all said we'd never touch, they've been drilled for oil. It's begun. The destruction has begun. And you don't even see what's going on until you actually start to research it and you see actually how much drilling's going on. And then you're going to get the oil spills. Bye-bye, marvelous fairy tale Antarctica. And if no one's there to see it, and if less and less people were in the general countryside anyway to see what's really going on, who's going to make a fuss? A good example of this recently is Greenland. Now, Greenland is starting to melt, so we get into the whole climate change debate, but it's revealing, therefore, areas where you can drill for oil. And you might think, we don't want to wreck Greenland. They've often said how important Greenland is to the world ecology. And yet, just a couple of months ago or so, the Prime Minister of Greenland, there's not many people there, but there's some, Aleqa Hammond, comes out and says, we want drilling, we want oil drilling here, selling it as a humanitarian exercise. Because she says, we're a very poor country, we need the money, we need the oil companies to be here. Please come and drill. I'm not being funny, this is a message. We want you, come in and drill. And yet, weirdly, and I don't know whether this is some strange double bluff, the very same week she said that, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, visits Greenland to raise awareness of the dangers of global warming and the terrible things that would happen if Greenland was ruined. You think, but the Prime Minister is trying to sell it off now to oil companies. What the hell is going on? And we are getting such a double message about climate change. Now, listen, let's not start ranting about climate change. We all know there are debates. We all know, if you really look at the evidence, it isn't settled. And we also know that there are bigger things that may affect it than us. I mean, how many times have you heard people from this platform talk about the sun? The sun, and it is now being acknowledged by some climatologists, has a profound effect on our planet, maybe bigger than we ever knew. It could be the sun that triggers the next stage in our evolution, potentially. It could also be the thing that throws us into a new ice age. If we get very low sunspots for many years, you're going to wind up with a little ice age again, and never mind global warming, we're all going to freeze for a while. Anything could happen because there are all kinds of things that we can't predict. Well, let's just go back to global warming. Okay, let's say it's real, and I'm not a climatologist. I'm willing to see evidence on any side. Let's assume it's real. How then do you justify the fact that they keep saying we've got to step back from a carbon economy? We need to save the world. Why then do we keep investing in the carbon economy? They keep having a go at us, but then they come up with things that are just carbon-based again. And then the very things that maybe could make a difference are the ones that are demonized. So now windmills, which I wouldn't want one next to my house, I agree. It's an issue. And solar farms, they're evil. I mean, look at the press coverage against wind farms. My God, it's like this is the biggest evil ever. Okay, yes, there are issues. Don't get me wrong. But I don't know about you. I'd rather have that than that next door to me, personally, if there was a choice. In any case, what about tidal power? What about wave power? They've often said that's one of the most reliable sources of energy. If we could invest in it and tap it, do we? No, because it's easier to get money from the carbon economy. And meanwhile, anybody that objects, however, to that are treated like this. The demonization of fracking protesters in the mainstream media is horrible. The fracking, the dirty tricks of the fracking deniers. People like Simon, who's put his neck on the line, his life on the line, and they're treated as absolute pariahs. It's mind manipulation. And we need to be really, really aware of it. And could this partly be because many of the people that own the mass media have invested in fracking? Yes, it could. Look at who's investing where and in what oil company, and you'll see, oh, now it makes sense. You will not get a fair hearing for anti-fracking, if you wish, in the mainstream media. And you damn well won't get a fair hearing on the BBC. The good old BBC that is now nothing more than a propaganda tool. I hate to say it. Apologies to those of you in the room that work for the BBC. It is a propaganda tool. And if anybody heard the Life Scientific on Radio 4 a couple of weeks ago, a half-an-hour slab of pro-fracking propaganda from a woman who works for the Geological something or another, who actually said it is irresponsible to oppose fracking. It's irresponsible for the human future. And that's what they keep saying. What they've cleverly done, so the old lady's dying because they can't put the gas on, their point of thinking, it's your fault. We could have all this cheap gas, and you don't want us to, and you've killed that nice old lady over there. That's what's happening. Isn't it amazing? And it somehow worked. And yet, look at what the media doesn't report. I mean, we keep hearing about Ukraine and Gaza and Syria. There's been very little coverage of what's going on in Venezuela. The odd bit comes up here and there. Venezuela's been in basically revolution since Hugo Chavez died. And Chavez, of course, to many degrees, championed the people. But the rebels that suddenly arose shortly after he died, well, they're clearly very pro-America. And Hugo Chavez was very much not pro-America. And so it's looking horribly like we've got another rebellion or something going on that is going to benefit America ultimately. And maybe that's why we're not hearing very much about it. And so there are massive things going on around the world we simply do not hear about. Interesting, though, when the mainstream media is forced to report something that has to go into slightly more alternative realms, it's not sure which way to go. So the missing Malaysian aeroplane, you could give a whole presentation about it. Is it on Diego Garcia, the US base in the Indian Ocean? Did it really crash? Is it still? Who knows? There are so many theories. But what did happen when this was being reported in the mainstream press was that it made people have to accept alternative ideas, because nobody knew where it was. And I got phoned up by the BBC and said, would you come on and talk about the alternative theories? Now, ironically, I couldn't do it. So I deployed Marcus Allen, the best man of all, to do it, who did a very fine job, I understand. But, for once, they actually had, just briefly, to discuss it. Now that's all gone already. And in fact, the reason it's gone is because the media either just thinks it's an old story, or they've already solved the mystery. If you read the Sunday Sport, the mystery is solved. Isn't that nice? Missing plane found on the moon. Hilarious, unless you're one of the relatives. Really hilarious, isn't it? Well, there we go. Right, I keep tapping into Jason territory, but Jason showed this picture yesterday. But let's say a little bit more about it. This is a diagram of the internet. If you follow all the links and all the lines and you make it into art, this is the internet. Isn't it beautiful? It is the beginning of the global brain. Many people think, as Jason touched on yesterday, that this is the beginning of a collective consciousness that is accelerated with technology. And for all my harping on about sat-navs, I'm not anti-technology. Do not misunderstand me. But there are dreams and nightmares coming, and we need to go into the future with full consciousness of what we're doing. That's my point. I hope you understand. So, the collective mind, we've talked many times in the past about collective consciousness. And it's crucial, and it is powerful. And if you can gather lots of minds focusing on one thing at the same time, as the Global Consciousness Project has now proved in essence, and that began at Princeton University, not a bunch of idiots, think what could be done. And therefore, the information that flows around the world is crucial. That is why I think the powers that be are so desperate to contain it. And of course, the internet has been the big gift, and now it's under massive threat. This is Turkey. Few months ago. Turkey shut down the internet one week because there was too much stuff against the Turkish government. So they shut it down. That didn't go down very well, as I'm sure you can imagine. Here's one of the street protests. Now, maybe that was a bit drastic, and indeed they realized that wasn't going to work, and they had to put it back online. But on a more surreptitious and more gentle way, I'm afraid we're all dealing with exactly the same thing. This story, Google sets up the right to be forgotten. That's the worst news story you've heard this year. It is. You just haven't realized it yet. Google has now been told that if anybody wants something removed from their search engines, they have to remove it. Great. So any corruption, anybody has done anything, if they harangue Google enough, it now must be taken down, or at least the search facility to find it must be taken down. That's the end of the internet as a free tool. It's already happened. And you probably didn't even notice. That's the worst ruling you've ever seen in terms of the freedom of information on the internet. Fight this with every bone in your body if you truly believe the internet has opened up conversations we couldn't have had 30 years ago. And it has. It has a shadow side, of course, but it has a fantastic side, of course. And more or less at the same time, you then get the surveillance bill being pushed through Parliament so quickly, nobody had a chance to read it. Oodles of small print. Do you think the MPs had time to read that in 1 week? No. They pushed it through. The old EU ruling basically said, no, actually, you can't do what you're doing. So Britain, being Britain, said, right, we're going to have our own rules. So they pushed it through, and it was emergency legislation. And in so doing, they gave themselves even more power of surveillance. Go and read the small print. I bet you haven't, and I don't blame you, because it takes too long, and that's the trouble. They all know we're all too distracted and busy in our lives. So they've now given themselves every power to listen to everything and anything. And places like GCHQ, in Cheltenham, are doing extremely dubious things. And Edward Snowden has shown us the reality of what's going on. By the way, I was looking at this picture when I was putting this presentation together, thinking GCHQ, it really reminds me of something. What does that remind me of? And I realized it reminds me of a Dalek flying saucer, which is rather apt, isn't it? Because surveillance and control is exactly what the Daleks would do. Funny, isn't it? Chance, I'm sure, but interesting chance. So, the censorship of the internet is coming through more nefarious ways. One thing you may have heard about is the fact that David Cameron now wants all internet servers to send everyone a message asking you whether or not you want to watch pornography on your computer. Now, a lot of people don't want to watch it, so they go, oh, no. So you'll click, no, I don't want to see it. You go, oh, I don't want to see that stuff. But what you don't know is, when you click that button, what you are also clicking to ban, to block, is, get this, esoteric content. In the small print of the current legislation they're trying to push through, not only will you not have access to pornography, you will not have access to esoteric content. What the hell does that mean? Well, it means everything we talk about here, be guaranteed. It means truth websites. It means anything remotely into fringe spirituality as it would be promoted. This is real. Now, there is some hope, because they were trying to push this through by the end of 2013. The reason they couldn't was so many people protested. They're going forward, though. They want this to happen. It's the small print. Fantastic, isn't it? And you won't even know you've said yes to it. But if you say, I don't understand, why can't I find, the 9/11 Truth website? They'll say, you told us you didn't want to see it. But most people will never even know, and they won't find those sites. It's blocking off knowledge. It's hampering the global brain. And what will happen is that all the major companies will provide you with fantastic internet, super fast, big, and only giving you access to certain websites. And after a while, people will forget that all the other ones even exist. In the first edition of my book, The Truth Agenda, I wrote about this 5 years ago, and sadly, it's coming true. And it's becoming more true now by the day. That the new internet will simply not give any access to all the key stuff that made it such a liberation in the first place. And of course, when we're walking around with our Google Glass on, and that's given you your everyday experience, you may never know anymore. You're not being shown certain things. You might be walking down the street and told which cafe to go to, but you won't be told that, hey, there's a truth campaigner lives here, or any of that. They will be removed. So we are selectively now editing the global brain and chopping bits off. This is very, very dangerous. And as I've said before, once this technology starts to be biologically absorbed into our bodies, as it will through implants, and we start to interface, we will become what we are basically controlled to become. And when we're all living with a net in our head, and that is the global brain, if we have allowed that global brain to be compromised from the start, we have cut off an important part of the human race's consciousness. And, talking about presence, when we all got the internet in our eyes soon, who's ever really going to be present? Oh, already people walk around looking at their phones most of the time, don't they? Well, can you imagine? Dreams and nightmares, wonderful things. But one interesting thing coming out of it takes me back to a talk I gave years ago. It's changing younger people's perceptions of how they think they can participate in the world. Most young people today do not partake in the political process, and there are reasons for this. One of the reasons given is that because we want the technology we use. Why can't we vote using the phone? And the answer is because electronic voting is not really that reliable yet, which it probably isn't. There is some electronic voting in booths, which they claim is reliable. But people are saying, yeah, but if I could just vote from my phone, I would vote. One day, I believe the technology will become available where you will be able to do this and verify that it wasn't changed somewhere down the line. Because you see, unfortunately, if you want younger people to participate, you've got to see it through their eyes. They look at this, what is this? This is just like Gilbert and Sullivan. This is just some antiquated, ancient thing that has no relation to their lives. And if they behaved impeccably, if they were bastions of enlightenment, well, maybe that would be different. But then, as the stories keep coming out by the day, we realize they are not. And potentially the paedophile inquiry, and it's more than Cyril Smith, you can bet your life, and you can bet your life the shredders in Westminster are going 10 to the dozen at the moment. Potentially, this is the biggest scandal ever of a paedophile network within Westminster itself. So you got that. That hardly fills you with any enthusiasm. But even that aside, which is a whole other talk, note how the government cleverly managed to focus everybody onto Rolf and Jimmy and the entertainment industry as if they were hoping it would all get swept up there. But note how they didn't take it on themselves, and now it's bubbling up from beneath. But even aside from all of that, I mean, just look at them. Can I speak frankly? What a bunch of arseholes. Really? Excuse me, but how can you respect them? How can you respect the way they behave in Parliament, the way they behave outside? Ed Miliband, he's a walking robot. And they all do the hand signals. Notice this. They all do the same trained, somebody's told them to do this. And they're not feeling, they're not even doing it for real. They're fake. And we shouldn't respect them. And younger people are saying, why do we need a bunch of them to be making decisions we could all make? I vote for a Vaz. I vote on all kinds of internet signatures. And why can't we all vote? And there will come a time where it will make no sense that 600 people in an old room are making decisions for us. Now, if everybody voted just through their phones, would you get good decisions? No, maybe not, but it would be real democracy. But then you get increasingly the younger generations to think, okay, I want to participate. When they're faced with something like this, they go, what? Wooden voting, but with a pencil on a string. Sorry, what is this? And they wonder why nobody's voting. Now, here is an issue. Russell Brand. Okay, we talked about Russell Brand. Now, one thing I don't agree with, he says we shouldn't vote. I'm not saying we shouldn't participate in the political process. I think we should. He says we shouldn't vote because you're supporting a moribund, institution. I disagree because the problem then is, well, that's only good if you're replacing it with something. His revolution doesn't offer any replacement. So that's no good. And, the rule of law and democracy has been hard fought for. I'm a big student of history. A lot of blood's been shed to get where we are. And what we've got is flawed, it's corrupt, but it's better than many places. Here's a map of the world over the last 2 years, the main trouble spots of the world. Dark, bad. Orange, slightly less bad. And if you look at what the places that are in most unrest have in common, they have quite a weak rule of law. The democracy is very shaky, and there's coups every other day. So I think we do need a system. I don't believe just in anarchy, but it needs to be a system that can work for everybody and is truly enlightened. That's what's not right. And by the way, I'm not looking down on other countries. I'm not looking at them saying, oh, look at them, they're a bit primitive, don't worry about them. Hey, guess what? We were the same. Look at our history. Only a few hundred years ago, the Wars of the Roses, massive egos, battling it out, tribal warfare in essence. But out of that, eventually, came something else, came more order. That's what other countries are going through. We're going at different paces. It's not a judgment, it's the reality. One day they may surpass us in enlightenment. Give it a few hundred years, you don't know. The English Civil War, the parliamentarians versus the royalists. That was a big deal because ultimately what it was about was who speaks for God. Oliver Cromwell later thought he was. Charles I thought he was. But out of all this came incredible enlightened thinking. We had the levelers. We had people coming forward, challenging absolutely everything. They thought, right, everything's up for grabs. If the king no longer speaks for God, well, actually, let's reevaluate everything. You had the diggers who believed everybody should have access to the land for free because God had given it to them. You had the ranters who were very sexually out there and incredibly adventurous for their day. And you had the Quakers that, my God, said God could speak through you. Outrageous. And this caused the publications of books like this, The World Turned Upside Down. And it was like, the world is upside down. What's happening? We're in exactly the same place today. Now, people have been very radical. They're challenging everything, and equally the state is afraid. And one interesting example of that, I thought, was, the gay marriage bill. That really touched a lot of nerves. And this was something clearly a lot of people wanted, and it's gone through. And personally, I think it should have gone through. But where it was mishandled, I think, was the fact that Cameron railroaded it and didn't give enough discussion time to explain why this had to be done, why it mattered. And what it came across as was, right, so Mr. Cameron, you're speaking for God now, are you? Because a lot of people think marriage, this was a long thing all connected with the Holy Spirit and all that. And suddenly it was, oh no, but now David Cameron can make that decision. It was more complex than that. But that's why there were opposition to it. But then we had people saying, the world's turned upside down. David Sylvester, the UKIP candidate, said the flooding last year was God's punishment because we let gay marriage take place. Well, so, we're not so enlightened in some ways. But, everything's up for grabs. Everything. The EU debate. Are we in the EU? Are we out? That's massive. And especially if you do believe the EU is one of the Orwellian superstates. I'm not saying I have the solution for this, but we need to decide who we are, what we are in the world. And never mind the EU, our own country is potentially about to break up. If Scotland votes yes to become independent, there's going to be a massive clamour around England for other independent regional assemblies. And we're going to say, hang on, we want what they've got. If Scotland votes no, the same thing ultimately will happen. Because there's a lot of people that will feel disaffected and feel they weren't listened to in Scotland. The United Kingdom, as it was, is about to break up. And the world is going through massive change at the moment. That's what everything is all about. It is an opportunity for transformation, however. We, for those of you that know the tarot, stand at a crucial moment. The Fool, the card, the Fool. And tarot, he's the Fool, not because he's stupid, because he's just a bit lackadaisical. He's going, hey, la, la, and he's about to fall off the cliff. That's where we're at now. There's so much opportunity. There's so many new ideas. People are challenging everything. That's why the estate is desperate to shut down the internet as a free tool. Because they see this coming, they see this erupting all over the world. That's why they're desperate to create destabilization in other countries. Keep them down. Don't let the resulting enlightenment that came out of things like the English Civil War, don't let it become anything. Keep the status quo. And that is why be so careful how easily you are controlled and told what to do. So we had a bit of tomfoolery with the sat-nav earlier, but there's a serious, serious point to it. And I woke up one morning, because I've been thinking about the presentation, and this phrase was in my head, and I wrote it down because I thought I'll never say it right. This phrase came to me when I was putting this presentation together, which is this: by losing our ability to self-navigate our way through the world, we lose our true sense of place within it and are left at the mercy of those who would direct our every movement through it. Now, I don't quite know where that came from, but I feel inherently there's something meaningful to that. So we're all standing effectively on the edge of the cliff now, and we got a choice. We can either go, ooh, and never jump, or we can all tumble down and fall down the bottom horribly, or, well, guess what? Make the leap. We're all going to have to go the extra mile, whether that be in the way you behave in your life, whether that be in what you say to other people around you. My solution for making the leap is just this. Do whatever you do with real passion. The whole point of this symposium, hopefully, is to inspire you to go out with information and new ideas and then live it in your life. If you go out of here and it stops at the door, you've wasted your money, okay? Go out and do something, even if it's fighting for your local bus shelter, even if it's just fighting against fracking, whatever it is. You can't all change the world, but do something, do it with passion, make a leap. And if we all do that, then I think the future will be very different for what seems to be being plotted out for us at the moment. There's a real choice here, but there really is an opportunity. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.